He was 15 years old when he carved a vow into his soul that would cost him everything and give him everything. Standing at Incheon Airport's international terminal, jaw clenched against the tears he refused to shed, watching the only light in his darkness vanish beyond security gates, Lee Sung-minit made a promise that sounded insane even to his own ears. 10 years. I'll wait 10 years, build an empire no one can control, and come back for you. His father, the cold architect of Seoul's most feared crime dynasty, had ripped them apart, called her a fatal weakness, orchestrated her family's exile, believed he was protecting his heir from disaster. He had no idea he was forging the most dangerous man Seoul would ever know. A man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Fast forward a decade, he's now the youngest mafia boss in the Lee family's 80-year history, standing in a Lagos architecture firm, face-to-face with Barbara Wilson again. And on her finger, she still wears the jade ring he gave her that night. The wait is over. If you're feeling this story, hit the subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what you think will happen next. Your support means everything to us. The hallway emptied whenever Lee walked through it. At 13, he'd already learned to read the subtle shifts in posture, the way eyes dropped and conversations died mid-sentence. His father's lessons had carved something into him that other students could sense even if they couldn't name it. The particular stillness of someone who'd been trained to hurt people efficiently and without hesitation. Seoul's International Academy catered to diplomats' children and corporate heirs, kids who'd lived in 5 countries by age 12 and spoke 3 languages fluently. Lee spoke 4, but rarely used any of them. Speech was inefficient. His father had taught him that words were tools of manipulation or misdirection, nothing more. The truth lived in the space between heartbeats, in the micro-expressions that flickered across faces before conscious thought could suppress them. He moved through the school like a ghost in a designer uniform, attending classes where teachers avoided calling on him and students shifted their desks imperceptibly away. The isolation suited him. Emotion was dangerous. His father had made that brutally clear through methods that left no visible marks but carved deep into his nervous system. Fear was weakness. Attachment was vulnerability. Compassion was a blade that could be turned back on you. Then Barbara Wilson arrived on a Tuesday in October, and everything Lee thought he understood about survival protocols proved catastrophically incomplete. She was 15, daughter of Nigeria's deputy ambassador to South Korea, and she carried herself with the unconscious confidence of someone who'd never learned to make herself smaller. Her transfer paperwork listed her as Barbara, but she introduced herself to their world history class as Bimp, the Yoruba name her grandmother had given her. When the teacher stumbled over the pronunciation, she laughed. Not the nervous laughter of someone seeking approval, but genuine amusement at life's minor absurdities. Lee watched her with the clinical detachment his training demanded, cataloging potential threat vectors and behavioral patterns. She moved wrong for this environment, too open, too unguarded, lacking the sophisticated social armor that protected the other students. She'd be isolated within days, he calculated. Possibly targeted by the casual cruelty that thrived in spaces where children had too much power and too little supervision. The books spilled from her locker between 3rd and 4th period, cascading across the hallway floor in a waterfall of textbooks and notebooks. Students flowed around the obstacle like water around a stone, not stopping, barely looking. Lee had already begun his own trajectory past the scene when Barbara dropped to her knees and started laughing. Not crying, not cursing. Laughing. Of course, she said to no one in particular, gathering scattered papers. Of course the locker demon strikes on my 3rd day. Lee stopped. The movement felt involuntary, a glitch in his operational programming. He stood 3 meters away, caught between forward momentum and something he couldn't identify. Not quite curiosity, not quite concern, but a flicker of recognition that this person processed the world through entirely different protocols than everyone else in this building. Barbara looked up and saw him. The hallway had cleared automatically around Lee, that invisible radius of caution that followed him everywhere. Her eyes met his without flinching, without the usual calculation of threat assessment. She tilted her head slightly, still kneeling among her scattered belongings, and smiled. You gonna help or just stare? The question hung in the air between them, utterly without fear or subtext or manipulation. A simple inquiry from one human to another, as if Lee were just a regular teenage boy who might reasonably help someone pick up dropped books. He'd never been asked that question before, had never been spoken to as if he was simply ordinary. Lee knelt down and started gathering textbooks. Lee was 15 when he realized the rooftop had become his only sanctuary. 2 years had passed since that first encounter in the library, and their friendship had evolved into something neither of them could fully articulate. They met during lunch periods when the rest of the student body congregated in the cafeteria or sprawled across the quad. The rooftop was forgotten territory, accessible through a maintenance door that Barbara had discovered during her first week at the academy. She'd shared the secret with Lee, and it became theirs alone. The view stretched across manicured grounds toward the city skyline beyond, but Lee rarely looked at it anymore. His attention had shifted to the girl who sat beside him, legs dangling over the edge of the concrete barrier, her uniform blazer discarded in the spring warmth. Barbara was 17 now, her features had sharpened with maturity, but her eyes still held that same fierce determination he'd first witnessed in the library. She talked with her hands when she was passionate about something, gestures wide and expressive, so different from the controlled movements of the people in his father's world. "I've been thinking about Lagos," she said, unwrapping the sandwich she'd brought from home. Her mother still packed her lunch despite Barbara's protests that she was too old for it. Not just visiting, but actually going back after graduation. There's so much work to be done there. Lee shifted his position against the wall, drawing his knees up. Going back how? Architecture. The word came out like a declaration of war. Sustainable housing projects for communities that need them. My uncle sends me photos sometimes of the neighborhoods where people build with whatever materials they can find. Corrugated metal, scrap wood, anything. They deserve better. They deserve structures that won't collapse in the rainy season, that won't turn into ovens during the dry months. Her passion radiated outward, infectious and overwhelming. Lee found himself leaning forward, caught in her orbit as she described design concepts she'd been sketching. Solar panel integration, rainwater collection systems, materials that could withstand the climate while remaining affordable. At school, she couldn't bear to look at Lee's empty seat. The rumors had evolved. Now they whispered that he'd been sent to a psychiatric facility, that he'd tried to run away 3 times, that his father had hired security to watch him around the clock. She didn't know what was true anymore. The gates had stayed closed for 14 days. Then, on a Thursday night at 11 p.m., her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Han River Park. South entrance. Come alone. Barbara's hands shook as she read it. She should ignore it. This was insane. But she was already pulling on her jacket, already climbing out her bedroom window onto the fire escape like some desperate character in a drama. The rational part of her brain screamed warnings, but her heart had taken over completely. The taxi ride felt eternal. When she finally reached the park, the pathway lights cast long shadows across the empty walkway. The river stretched dark and infinite beyond the railing. Seoul's glittering skyline reflected on its surface like a city made of broken glass. She spotted him standing at the water's edge, hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the October cold. Lee. He turned, and her breath caught. He looked hollowed out, like someone had scooped away everything vital and left only the shell. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He'd lost weight, but when he saw her, something flickered back to life in his expression. Something raw and desperate and achingly real. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I came." She closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching him, afraid that contact might shatter whatever fragile control he was clinging to. "Lee, what happened? Where have you been?" "Home. Prison. Same thing." His laugh was bitter, broken. "My father's made his position very clear. Cambridge is arranged. My engagement to the finance minister's daughter will be announced at my graduation. Every aspect of my life has been mapped out like a military campaign." His voice cracked. "And none of it includes you." Barbara felt tears burning behind her eyes. "So what do we do?" "I don't know. I've been trying to find a way, anyway, but I'm 17 years old and he controls everything. My money, my future, my freedom. Right now, I'm powerless." He finally looked at her, really looked at her, and the naked anguish in his eyes nearly destroyed her. I can't protect you from him. I can't even protect myself. Then we run. Tonight. We just... Way. Lee's voice was gentle but firm. He'd find us in hours. He has resources you can't imagine. And when he did, he closed his eyes. I won't let him hurt you to punish me. I won't. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they couldn't say, everything they couldn't have. Barbara felt her future splitting into two impossible paths. One with him, one without. Both felt like dying. Then Lee's hand moved to his right ring finger. He twisted off a jade ring she'd never noticed him without. Deep green stone set in aged gold, carved with characters she couldn't read. This ring has been worn by Lee patriarchs for 4 generations, he said quietly. My great-grandfather wore it when he built our first factory. My grandfather wore it when he survived the war. My father wore it when he expanded our empire across Asia. He held it up to the light, and the jade glowed like captured fire. It represents everything they want me to be. Their legacy, their expectations, their version of honor. He reached for her hand, pressed the warm metal into her palm, closed her fingers around it. I'm giving it to you because you represent everything I want to become. Someone who chooses love over power. Someone brave enough to be real. Barbara stared at the ring, her vision blurring with tears. Lee. 10 years. His voice was steel wrapped in silk. I'll spend every day of the next decade becoming powerful enough that not even my father can control me. I'll build my own empire if I have to. And then I'm coming for you, Barbara Chen. I don't care if you're in New York or California or on the moon. I will find you. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. Will you wait for me? She couldn't speak past the sob in her throat, so she just nodded. 10 years. 20. Forever. Forever, he echoed, and then he was kissing her. Desperate and tender and goodbye all at once. She tasted salt and promises, felt his hands shaking in her hair, memorized the warmth of him because she didn't know when she'd feel it again. In the distance, sirens began to wail, police or ambulance, some emergency in the glittering city. Lee pulled back, pressed his forehead to hers. That's my world, he whispered. Always crisis. Always control. Always cold. He kissed her once more, softer. But you're my warmth. Don't forget that. Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. Barbara stood alone by the river, clutching a jade ring that weighed more than gold, and watched the city lights blur into stars through her tears. 10 years. She could wait 10 years. She would wait forever. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a systematic dismantling of the boy who'd loved his mother and the construction of something harder, something impenetrable. Between 15 and 25, Lee Castellano became the weapon his father had always intended to forge, but with one critical difference: he chose the shape of the blade himself. At 17, he sat across from men 3 times his age and made them flinch. His father watched from the shadows as Lee negotiated territorial disputes with a precision that bordered on surgical. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He'd learned that the quietest man in the room was always the most dangerous, and Lee made silence into an art form. When Angelo Rossi tried to short them on a shipment deal, Lee simply placed a photograph on the table. Angelo's daughter leaving her private school. He never made a threat. He didn't have to. The shipment arrived in full the next morning. His father called it instinct. Lee called it necessity. By 19, he'd eliminated his first rival without firing a single shot. Marco Benedetti had been positioning himself as the heir apparent, spreading whispers that Lee was too young, too untested. Lee didn't argue. Instead, he orchestrated a series of business failures that left Marco's operations hemorrhaging money, his reputation in tatters, his allies abandoning him like rats from a sinking ship. When Marco finally came to beg for mercy, Lee offered him a position in the legitimate businesses, a humiliation worse than death in their world. Marco took it. Everyone understood the message. The organization expanded under his influence. Where his father saw only traditional revenue streams, Lee saw opportunities in legitimacy. He pushed them into real estate development, into construction companies, into import-export businesses that could launder money so cleanly even the feds couldn't trace it. He built an empire with two faces, one for the world to see, one hidden in the shadows. His father grudgingly approved. Results were hard to argue with. But Lee carried a weight his father never saw. In his jacket pocket, against his heart, he kept Barbara's photograph. The edges were worn from his fingers, tracing them in private moments. It was his secret rebellion, his reminder that he'd made a promise to a woman who'd loved him when he was still capable of being loved. Every brutal negotiation, every calculated move, every step up the ladder, he told himself it was for her. That somehow, by becoming untouchable, he could protect what little remained of her memory. At 22, during a negotiation that would determine control of the waterfront territories, his mentor, old Vincent Caruso, who'd served 3 generations of Castellanos, pulled him aside. The meeting had been particularly vicious. Lee had just convinced the Mocchetti family to surrender their holdings by presenting evidence of federal surveillance they didn't know existed. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution performed with paperwork. Vincent studied him with eyes that had seen too much. What drives you, Lee? Power? Fear? Revenge? Lee's hand moved unconsciously to his jacket, to the pocket over his heart where Barbara's photograph rested. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Something human, something vulnerable. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask he wore so perfectly that even he sometimes forgot it was a mask. A promise, he said simply. Vincent nodded slowly, understanding more than Lee wanted him to. Promises can be dangerous things in our world. They make you predictable. Only if people know about them. By 25, Lee stood where his father had once stood, but higher. He was the youngest boss in the family's century-long history, and the power dynamics had shifted in ways his father hadn't anticipated. Raymond had created a monster, yes, but not one he could control. Lee had taken everything his father taught him and refined it, weaponized it, turned it into something more efficient and more terrifying than Raymond's old-school brutality. The empire Lee built was untouchable because it looked legitimate. The man Lee became was unreachable because he'd buried his humanity so deep that even he sometimes forgot where he'd hidden it. But every night, alone in his penthouse overlooking the city he controlled, he'd take out that photograph and remember the woman who'd made him promise to survive. He'd kept that promise. But the cost was becoming someone she might not recognize. Lee stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Hong Kong office, watching the harbor lights shimmer below like fallen stars. 25 years old, and he commanded an empire his father had built through blood and calculation. The triad's legitimate fronts, shipping companies, entertainment venues, real estate holdings, generated billions. But Lee knew the truth beneath the polished surface. Every skyscraper had foundation stones laid in violence. His father sat across the mahogany desk, silver threading through his hair now, eyes still sharp as broken glass. West Africa. The old man's voice carried the weight of skepticism. We have no infrastructure there, no connections. Which is precisely why it's strategic. Lee pulled up the presentation on his tablet, sliding it across the desk. Nigeria's construction sector is exploding. $30 billion infrastructure gap. Chinese companies are already moving in, but they're making mistakes, using imported labor, ignoring local partnerships. We can do better. His father studied the numbers, and Lee saw the exact moment calculation overtook suspicion. This was the language the old man understood: profit margins, market penetration, strategic positioning. Not the truth that had driven Lee to spend 3 months building this proposal, cross-referencing every architectural firm in Lagos until he found the name that made his breath stop. Lagos is unstable, his father said, but his tone had shifted. He was testing now, not refusing. Lagos is hungry. Lee stood, moving to the map projected on the wall. 8% GDP growth. Population exploding. They need housing, commercial centers, transportation infrastructure. We establish Wilson and Associates as our primary architectural partner, They're British-owned, impeccable reputation, local expertise. We bring the capital and the connections. They bring the legitimacy we need. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. Legitimacy. As if money could ever wash clean. His father was quiet for a long moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin. You would oversee this personally. Someone has to ensure it's done right. Lee kept his voice level, businessman to businessman. Our reputation is at stake. I'll establish the Lagos office myself, build the relationships, lay the groundwork. 6 months, maybe a year. And if it fails? Then we've diversified our portfolio and learned a valuable lesson about African markets. Lee met his father's eyes without flinching. But it won't fail. The old man smiled, and it was like watching a shark breach water. You have your mother's audacity. Very well. But Lee, his voice dropped to the tone that had once ordered executions with a whisper. Do not make me regret this indulgence. Lee bowed his head in acknowledgement, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. His father didn't know, couldn't know, that this wasn't about expansion or legitimacy or strategic positioning. 3 days later, his intelligence team delivered the folder. Lee waited until he was alone in his office before opening it, hands steadier than they had any right to be. The first photograph showed a woman in a yellow hard hat, blueprints spread across a construction trailer table. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the elegant line of her neck, the determined set of her jaw. Professional. Focused. Everything the terrified girl on the boat had promised she could become. The second photo caught her laughing with a construction foreman, gesture animated as she pointed toward a half-built structure. The third showed her in a sharp blue suit, shaking hands with what looked like government officials. But it was the fourth photograph that made Lee's carefully constructed composure crack. A candid shot, Barbara walking down a Lagos street, phone pressed to her ear. The afternoon sun caught her right hand as she gestured while talking. On her ring finger, unmistakable even in the grainy surveillance photo, was a simple jade band. 10 years. She'd kept it for 10 years. Lee's hand trembled as he set the photo down. His team had included her full dossier, lead architect at Wilson and Associates, graduated top of her class from University of Lagos, worked on 3 major government infrastructure projects, engaged in local community development initiatives. She'd built exactly the life she'd described in whispered words on a container ship, while the ocean rocked beneath them and Lee had promised her freedom he had no right to guarantee. He opened his laptop and booked the flight himself. Lagos. 1 week. His assistant would arrange the business meetings, the official partnership discussions, the carefully choreographed dance of legitimate enterprise. But Lee knew the truth that pulsed beneath his ribs like a second heartbeat. He was going to see if she still remembered the boy who'd given her that ring. If she still wore it as a reminder or as a prison. If 10 years and an ocean of distance had been enough to wash away the blood that connected them. His phone buzzed. His father's message was characteristically brief. Don't disappoint me. Lee stared at Barbara's photograph for a long moment, memorizing the way sunlight caught in her hair, the confident stride, the jade glinting on her hand. I already have, he whispered to the empty office. Then he closed the folder and began preparing for Lagos. 10 years had carved Barbara into someone new. At 27, she commanded Wilson and Associates' largest conference room with the quiet authority of someone who'd earned every square foot of her success. Her tailored blazer spoke of careful choices, her portfolio of late nights and refused compromises. The jade ring caught morning light as she adjusted the architectural renderings one final time, a nervous habit she'd never quite broken. The Lee Corporation Expansion Project. 6 months of preparation distilled into this single meeting. Her team had reviewed every detail 3 times. The proposal was flawless. Her hands were steady as she arranged the presentation materials, her breathing controlled. She'd built this moment from nothing, from that girl who'd scrubbed floors and swallowed humiliation like bitter medicine. They are here, her assistant whispered from the doorway. Barbara smoothed her blazer, lifted her chin. The woman who walked toward that conference room door had survived too much to be intimidated by corporate executives, no matter how powerful. She'd learned to wear confidence like armor, to meet every challenge with a smile that revealed nothing. The door opened. 3 men in expensive suits entered first, executives whose names she'd memorized, whose preferences she'd studied. She shook their hands, made appropriate small talk, guided them to their seats with practiced grace. Professional, polished, perfect. Then he walked in. The world tilted. 10 years collapsed into seconds. Every carefully constructed wall, every hard-won piece of armor, every lesson in maintaining professional distance, gone. Just gone. Lee stood in her doorway wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her first year's salary, his presence filling the room like a physical force. Sharper than she remembered. Harder. The boyish edges she'd once glimpsed had been carved away by time and power, leaving something dangerous and controlled. His face could have been cut from stone, the face of a man who'd learned to show the world exactly nothing. But his eyes found hers, and time stopped. She watched something crack in that perfect mask. Raw. Unguarded. For one infinite second, she saw everything, shock, disbelief. Something that looked like pain so profound it took her breath away. His composure shattered and reformed in the space of a heartbeat, but she'd seen it. She'd seen him. Barbara's professional smile felt like broken glass on her face. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to stay, to demand answers, to pretend this was normal. She was supposed to be speaking. Introductions. She was supposed to be making introductions. Mr. Lee, she heard herself say, and her voice sounded almost normal. Almost. Welcome to Wilson and Associates. He moved toward her with that same fluid grace she remembered, but colder now. Controlled. Each step measured. When he extended his hand, she saw his fingers weren't quite steady. Ms. Okonkwo. His voice had deepened, carried weight and authority she didn't remember. But underneath she heard something that made her chest ache. Their hands touched. The contact shot through her like electricity. His palm was warm, his grip firm and professional, but his fingers tightened just slightly. So slightly she might have imagined it. Except she didn't imagine the way his breath caught, barely audible, or the way his jaw clenched. His gaze dropped to their joined hands, to the jade ring on her finger. She watched his face transform. Not the careful mask he showed the world, but something real and devastating. His eyes fixed on that circle of green stone like it was the only thing in the room, in the world. When he looked back up at her, his expression was naked with emotion he couldn't quite control. You kept it. 3 words, barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of 10 years, of unanswered questions, of a promise she'd worn on her finger through every victory and defeat. The other executives shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. The air in the conference room felt too thick to breathe, charged with something none of them could name but everyone could feel. Barbara pulled her hand back slowly, deliberately, straightened her shoulders, found that professional mask and forced it back into place even though her hands were shaking and her heart was trying to beat its way out of her chest. Shall we begin? Her voice was steady, controlled. A miracle. Lee nodded once, sharp and precise, and took his seat. But his eyes never left her face, and the room's tension stretched tight enough to snap. The boardroom emptied like water draining from a sink. Lee's team filed out first, their expensive shoes clicking against marble in retreat. Then Barbara's colleagues, carrying tablets and folders, their curious glances bouncing between the 2 figures who remained frozen in place. The door clicked shut. Silence crashed over them like a wave. 10 years of distance, of carefully constructed walls, of sleepless nights and what-ifs, all of it hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Barbara's office suddenly felt too small, the space shrinking until there was nothing but the few feet separating them and the thundering of her heart. Lee moved first. Just a step, but it shattered the stillness. His jaw was set, that familiar determination she'd fallen in love with all those years ago written across every line of his face. But his eyes, God, his eyes held something raw, something that made her chest tighten until she could barely breathe. I built an empire, he said, his voice low and rough. Each word landed like a confession. I became untouchable. The Lee Corporation isn't just successful, it's unstoppable. Billion-dollar deals, partnerships on 3 continents, respect from people who used to look through me like I was nothing. He took another step. I did it all for one reason. Barbara's vision blurred. She tried to blink the tears away, but they came anyway, hot trails down her cheeks that she couldn't stop, didn't want to stop. Her hand moved to her necklace, fingers closing around the ring that lived there, the ring that had become part of her, as essential as breathing. I wore this ring every single day for 10 years, she whispered, and her voice cracked on the confession. She pulled the necklace out, let the gold band catch the light. Through every date my parents set up. Through every dinner where they paraded eligible men in front of me like I was cattle at auction. Through every person who told me to move on, to be realistic, to stop waiting for a fantasy. Her thumb traced the ring's curve, the metal warm from her skin. Through every moment I doubted you'd come. Lee's face twisted with something between pain and triumph. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance that had stretched between them for a decade. This close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell with each controlled breath. He smelled like expensive cologne and ambition, but underneath it all, she caught something familiar, something that made her ache. "I'm done being what they made me," he said, and the words came out fierce, final. His hand reached up, fingers hovering near her face like he was afraid she might disappear. "I'm done playing by their rules, fitting into their world, pretending I built all this for power or money or respect." His thumb brushed her cheek, catching a tear. "I came to claim what's mine." The world tilted. Barbara surged forward at the same moment Lee pulled her in, and they collided, not gentle, not soft, but desperate and consuming. His lips found hers with 10 years of hunger behind them. 10 years of midnight thoughts and morning regrets and afternoons spent staring at nothing, remembering everything. Her hands fisted in his jacket, pulling him closer, trying to erase every inch of space that had existed between them. The kiss tasted like salt from her tears and felt like coming home after being lost at sea. His arms wrapped around her waist, solid and real, anchoring her to this moment, to this truth. Her fingers slid into his hair, and a sound escaped her throat, something between a sob and a sigh. When they finally broke apart, barely, their foreheads pressed together, breath mingling in the narrow space between them. "I never stopped loving you," Lee whispered against her lips, the words a vow, a promise, a declaration of war against everything that had tried to keep them apart. Barbara's eyes fluttered open, meeting his gaze. She saw everything there. The boy who'd loved her in secret, the man who'd conquered the world to prove himself worthy, the person who'd carried her in his heart through every victory and defeat. "Never," she breathed back, and the word held 10 years of truth. Not for a single day. Lee stood on the veranda of the Adeyemi family home in Lagos, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was about to do. Through the French doors, he could see Barbara's father sitting in his study, a man who had built his own empire through integrity rather than intimidation. The humid evening air clung to Lee's skin as he stepped inside, and Mr. Adeyemi looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Adeyemi," Lee began, his voice quiet but firm. "I love your daughter. I've loved her for 10 years. He didn't sit, didn't try to make himself comfortable. This wasn't a negotiation. "I won't pretend my world isn't dangerous. I won't lie and say my family's name doesn't carry blood. But I'm choosing to walk away from the darkness for her." He met the older man's eyes without flinching. "I'm not asking for permission because I'm powerful. I'm asking because she deserves a father who knows his son-in-law is worthy of her." Mr. Adeyemi studied him for a long moment, then stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden where Barbara was laughing with her mother. "10 years ago, you broke her heart," he said quietly. "She cried for months. Threw herself into work because it was the only thing that didn't remind her of you." He turned back to Lee. "What makes you think you deserve a second chance?" "I don't," Lee said simply. "But she gave me one anyway, and I will spend every day proving I'm worthy of it." Something shifted in Mr. Adeyemi's face. He saw the truth in Lee's eyes, the kind of certainty that couldn't be faked. "My daughter is stronger than you know," he said finally. "She survived losing you once. If you walk away again, she'll survive that too. But you won't." He extended his hand. "Don't make me regret this blessing." Lee took it, the handshake firm and binding. "I won't, sir." 3 days later, the Korean media exploded. Photographs of Lee and Barbara in Lagos flooded every news site and gossip column. The headlines screamed betrayal, scandal, disgrace. Lee's phone rang incessantly until he finally answered the one call that mattered. "End this," his father commanded, his voice like ice through the speaker. "You will not humiliate this family with some foreign mistress. You have responsibilities, a legacy to uphold." Lee stood at the window of his Lagos hotel room, watching the city lights flicker to life as the sun set. "I'm done living for your empire," he said, his voice calm and absolute. "I built my own. I made my own fortune, my own name, without your blood money or your threats. And I choose her." He paused, letting the words settle. "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you, this is my life now." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then the line went dead. 2 weeks later, Lee brought Barbara to Han River Park in Seoul. The same bench where they'd sat 10 years ago, where he'd let her walk away because he'd been too much of a coward to choose her. The water reflected the city lights, and the evening air carried the scent of street food and blooming flowers. Barbara looked at him, sensing something monumental in his silence. Lee reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. The jade ring, his family's heirloom, their symbol of power and legacy, was gone. In its place was something new, forged from the melted gold and jade, reshaped into a simple band with a single diamond. "I destroyed it," he said quietly, sinking to one knee. "I destroyed the symbol of everything they wanted me to be, because I don't want to be that man anymore." Barbara's breath caught, tears already streaming down her face. "You waited 10 years for me to be free," Lee continued, his voice raw with emotion. "You loved me when I was trapped, when I was broken, when I had nothing to offer but promises I couldn't keep. Now I'm asking, marry me, build a life with me, show our children that love is stronger than blood, that choosing each other is the bravest thing we'll ever do." She pulled him to his feet, kissing him through her tears. "Yes, God, yes, always yes." 6 months later, they married in Lagos with both families present. Lee's father attended, his face carefully neutral, but Lee caught him watching the ceremony with something that might have been understanding, perhaps even respect. The old man finally saw what his son had known all along. True power wasn't control or fear or legacy. It was choosing what you love and never letting go. 3 years after that, Lee and Barbara sat on their balcony watching the Lagos sunset, their son Richard playing with toy cars at their feet. The little boy had his mother's smile and his father's determination, blissfully unaware that his father had crossed continents and defied empires for love. "Was I worth the wait?" Lee asked, pulling Barbara close. She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Every single second." The promise was kept. Forever one. If you loved Lee and Barbara's journey from heartbreak to forever, like and subscribe for more stories where love conquers all. See you in the next video.